everybody. We got a nice turnout today. I really enjoy seeing everybody today. Some similar faces and then some new faces as well. And I don't know everybody that's on Zoom. Hopefully, some of my students are on Zoom as well. I told them about the conference a couple of days ago, so maybe some of them are out there as well in Zoomlandia. I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, and I met Andrea Martinez, Dr. Andrea Martinez, about 6 or 7 years ago, something like that. I've been here long enough now that I'm losing track of when I meet people, and I met Andrea when I was the director of Chicano Studies at the University of Utah here, where I worked. She was a graduate assistant in. Working on her doctoral program in Education, Culture, and Society, Department of Education, Culture, and Society. And I got to know her then briefly. Then I got to know her a little bit more just through community work. I got to know her son, who was swimming in Race Swami with my daughters and whatnot. So we kind of started developing a little bit of a connection. And I just kind of over the years followed her through Facebook, more recently through Facebook. She and when Rose and others were asking me if I knew people to speak, I said Andrea's came up for me because she's kind of becoming the definition of a chingona. Okay, and she's a little nervous right now too, because I sent her a note earlier, and she said she was nervous about coming and talking to the folks here because, she's talking to the trailblazers, right, of Chicano studies and things like that, and which is quite true. As you all know, I've been doing a lot of oral histories with a lot of yous in this group as well as outside of the group. And just about almost everybody has something to say about the Chicano studies movement. And, the first few years at the University of Utah, when there was maybe two, I think Albert was the first person I interviewed, and he said he remembered when there was like 2 or 3 Latinos on campus, and so we've come a long way. And Andrea, Dr. Martinez is going to kind of bring us up to speed on what we're doing now. And the reason she's a chingona is because we have her bio here, and I'll go ahead and read through it. But the other, before I even saw her bio and I mentioned Facebook and things like that, I've noticed that she's been doing some op-eds and things like that. And so she's really getting out there in the community. She lives in Rose Park now as well. So yay, all right, okay. So Dr. Martinez is an assistant professor of teacher education at Weber State University. Her research and teaching focus on culturally and linguistic responsive teaching methods, family school partnerships, community engagement, and teacher diversity recruitment and preparation. She received the WSU, Weber State University Hemingway Faculty Excellence Grant to fund community-based research to create a Weber State University Ogden Early Educator Initiative. This project seeks to increase the number of students from multilingual backgrounds entering the teaching profession in Ogden City. She received the 2023 Weber State's Presidential Teaching Excellence Award. She earned her bachelor's degree in Chicana and Chicano Studies and Sociology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and a master's and doctoral degree in Education, Culture, and Society from the University of Utah. She is a first-generation Chicana college graduate and originally from Northeast Los Angeles, California. But she also attended elementary school in her parents' native hometown of Jocotepec, Jalisco, Mexico. All right. Without further ado, let's welcome Professora Andrea Martinez.
Good afternoon. This is such an honor. Oh, good morning for me to be here. I quickly mentioned that 17 years ago, almost 17 years ago, and as Manuel walks in, he gave me my first job here at in Utah. 17 years ago, I was recruited from the University of California, Santa Barbara to come work for, I did not know the impact and importance that the Chicano Scholarship Fund had. So for a year, I worked with the Chicano Scholarship Fund, 17 years ago. And Margie, who is here, was also part of that committee when I was, and the meetings were down at the Youth Detention Center down in South Salt Lake. And I just remember being a graduate student working on some of the events that the scholarship was putting together. So it is quite a full circle, 17 years. I didn't think I was going to be here for this long. But Utah has a way to kind of rope you in, and everybody kept saying, you're going to stay, watch. And so now my little one is here, Emiliano Jose Martinez is here, and my spouse is here as well with my niece, who are here to also see the talk. So I just wanted to just say thank you so much for Ed for nominating me to be here with you. I am up at Weber State now. Before that, I worked for Granite School District and Canyon School District, always around the same idea of educational access and opportunity for our students. My presentation has a QR code, kind of like when you go to the restaurant, you can see the menu. Same kind of concept. If you scan this, you can actually follow along my presentation on your phone. So give you access to my presentation if you want to see what's next. Or like my students at Weber State, they get very anxious and just flip through the slides to know when it's going to be over. So I don't take it personal. And here, the title is La Lucha Sigue, keeping the story of the civil rights alive in tumultuous times. On the right is a picture of the 1968 school walkouts. And it's really grounding in that. I have with me, and I didn't get a chance to take a picture, but in 1970s, we also had a very similar walkout at West High School. And in West High School, the Salt Lake Tribune reported students, and it said skipping classes or missing classes. But it was also during the same time that here in Utah, we also had a very much a uprising and demanding better educational opportunity for students here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology. What do I mean by tumultuous times? And in preparing for this, I reached out to two colleagues who you all know very well, Chris Macias and Jared Martinez. And I said, I am presenting to living history. I want to do something that is creative, that is kind of showing a way to keep the stories alive. And I'm also a teacher, right? So for me, it's like, how does that look like? So I'm going to be talking about this concept of placemaking and digital mapping. And for that portion, my field research assistant is here, and it's Emiliano, my son. And so you'll see how he became my field assistant. And I want to talk, and this is a picture here from a digital archives by Margie Victoria Delgado's scrapbook that is at the University of Utah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about terminology because we use the words Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino, Hispanic, or, so Latine. And when I was growing up, I was born in Northeast Los Angeles or East Los Angeles, and Chicano was a word that was around me. That was just something we used, something that identified where I was at. And when I was going through the archives that you all have pushed the university to collect, I ran into this picture of that Margie's scrapbook has that was from that time period here in Utah. And it reads, Christians by the grace of God, gentlemen thanks to our Spanish descent, noble lords from our Indian ancestry, Mexicans by pride and tradition, and Americans by destiny, thus we are the Mexican Americans. And this particular image is actually something that was part of the early kind of flyers and conferences and events put together, not just here in Utah, but other parts, right? And it was an attempt to understand, like, who are we, right? What name do we call ourselves? And so Corky Gonzalez from I Am Joaquin has this from the poem I Am Joaquin, La raza, Mexicano, Español, Latino, Chicano, or whatever I call myself, I look the same, I feel the same, I cry and sing the same. Then Viola Correa wrote about La Nueva Chicana, and she said, hey, see that lady protesting against injustice? It's mi mama. That girl in the brown beret, the one teaching the children, she's my hermana. Over there, fasting with migrants, is mi tía. These are women who worry, pray, iron, and cook chile y tortillas. The lady with the forgiving eyes and the gentle smile, listen to hear her shout. She knows what hardship is all about, all about. The establishment calls her a radical militant. The newspapers read she is a dangerous subversive. They label her to condemn her. By the FBI, she's called a big problem. In Aztlán, we call her La Nueva Chicana. And so I wanted to present three different, right, that were happening around the same time, right? Who we are, how do we understand ourselves? And we currently still have that debate, right? When I started working at Weber State, they asked me, what's the right term? Is it Latine? Is it Latinx? Is it Chicana? Is it Chicano? And I said, well, ask the people what they would like to be referred to. And I was up in Ogden, and one of my students said, well, growing up, my dad would say the word Chicano because he would ride his lowrider on 25th Street. But then as I was going through school, I just became Hispanic. And then I became Latina. And I said, what do you use? She's like, I don't know. And I said, well, that's okay. I said, it is what you want to call yourself. And sometimes is situational, sometimes is context, right? When I'm in front of certain people and I use the word Chicana, they might not even know what that means. Sometimes it's Latina, right? Sometimes it's Mexican American, sometimes it's Mexicana. When I'm back in my parents' hometown, anybody want to guess what I am? Norteamericana or La Gringa or La Güera, right? So like it just becomes all these different terminologies. But what I tell people is that all our identity is always connected to our place and how we are trying to understand our belonging, right? And so with the students who self-identify as Latine or Latinx, I invite people to just hear, why do they feel that that term captures who they are? And at the time being, back then, they wrote about it. It was poems. They were trying to give itself a meaning. I have this here to talk about tumultuous times. Richard Valencia, he is a historian and also a critical race scholar, has been talking about the Mexican-American legal struggle even prior to Mendez and Westminster, and has always talked about, what did education look like for Mexican-Americans in the United States? And it's always been to talk about the unequal opportunities and access. And where are we now in 2023? This is from La Excelencia in Education report from 2023. Utah has the 23rd largest Latino population in the United States. And we know that, right? When I moved here in 2017, if I wanted to get anything, you had to go to Rose Park. I was a student at the University of Utah. Now, there's all these new places, even on the east side. The House of Corn did not exist before, and it's right by campus now, right? Lots of changes in Utah. In Utah, 18% of K-12 population was Latino, and it's almost 20%. And this is what I tell my future secondary ed students and educational leaders is you're going to get to a point where 1 out of 4 of your students are Latino or come from Latin America. 15% of the population was Latino in 2023. And looking at the archives from the 1970s, some people are talking about 5% back then. And so now we are 15%. The Hispanic median age is 26 compared to 33. 20% of Hispanics were enrolled in higher education compared to 27%. However, only 26% of Hispanic adults had earned an associate's degree or higher compared to 50%. So this report was really talking about the educational attainment. And so from where Valencia was talking about the history of segregation, the history of tracking, the history of going to college, graduating for college, number of Hispanic Latino doctors and lawyers and teachers, to where we at now, we can say that we have made some strides, but we're not quite there yet. Right? That's the work that I do now in Ogden. City is saying we are graduating students at a 90%, but less than 10% of the graduating class of Ogden City School District was attaining college. And we are Weber State, we are a dual enrollment campus, an open enrollment. And I said, we need to do something, right? We need to ensure, is it more access? Is it more opportunities? Is it more scholarships? What is going on? And that has always been the question. And so identity and place have always been intertwined. And on your right, on my left here, your right, is a picture of Cesar Chavez Avenue. And I wanted to situate myself because I was born at White Memorial Hospital, and I tell this to my son. It is called Cesar Chavez Avenue. And when I moved to Utah, this is what I saw when I moved to Utah. The Cesar Chavez Avenue right on 500 South here in Salt Lake City. And I grew up right next to the LA River. Now I live in Rose Park next to the Jordan River, right? I'm from the Lago de Chapala. I'm right next to the Lago Salado, right? So I've always felt that where I'm from has shaped my identity and my sense of belonging. And I remember coming here and people would say, there's no Latinos here, there's no Hispanics here. And I was like, well, yes, there is. You're just not looking, right? You're just not looking. And so I started thinking about like, how am I going to talk about where we are in Tumultuous times? And I started thinking about, well, Utah is known for tourism and monuments and historical sites. I've done the national parks with my son and I have two sons. I've taken them to see historical sites, and I've just, the mountains, I became a whole Utahn, like camping, hiking, right? Eating everywhere, right? So, but I started thinking like, I have 2 kids and I want them to be proud to be Mexican American, to be Chicano. But the places here don't show that history, right? At the University of Utah, when I wrote the op-ed that every semester I ask my students and I say, raise your hand if you heard the name Archie Archuleta. Nobody has. And I said, raise your hand if you heard the name Pete Swanson. Nobody has. Raise your hand if you know about and I just kind of start talking about when I said Archie Archuleta, they're like, oh, the singer, and I said, no, that's the other Archuletas. Like Archie would say, oh no, I'm not related to those Archuletas. And I said, what about Representative Romero? I hadn't heard. And I said, that's what happens when we're left out of the textbooks. You are teachers going to be teaching secondary education in our high schools and in middle school, but yet these have been leaders in our community. And Ed has done this project of collecting oral histories. And that's how we know about our stories, is through collection of oral histories. But they're there, right? And my 10-year-old, I want to be able to take him somewhere and say, Chicanos have always been part of Utah. And so I started thinking, and I called Chris and I said, Chris, what is a building or a place that tells the history of Chicanos in Utah? And he's like, let me think about it. Let me call you back. And I called my friend Jared. Jared, tell me a place where I can teach my 10-year-old about the history of Chicanos and the civil rights movement here in Utah. And he's like, let me call you back, right? And I said, I want to do a kind of like we have these tours for the Mighty Five and historical sites. If I were to take my class or even my children, where would I take them? And so I started thinking, because I'm an academic, about why is it the case that our stories are not reflected beyond a Cesar Chavez Boulevard, right? Historical site designation. We know, and I have some of the slides here, that multiple books have been written about Chicanos here in Utah, but we're still fighting for, first, the ethnic studies bill passed, but it's still in committee creation, right? We know that we've been promised a creation of lesson plans, right? And so I started thinking a lot about this notion of racist nativism. So racist nativism is a framework by Perez Hoover from 2008. And she operationalized this concept as the assigning of values to real or imagined differences in order to justify the superiority of the native. And here the native meaning those who are thought to be who this land belongs to, okay? Who is perceived to be white over that of the non-white, who is perceived to be the people of and immigrants of color, and thereby defend the native rights to dominance. So in her research, she talks a lot about undocumented students and talks about the villainizing of undocumented students as criminals, as invaders, in order for a lot of the policies, even here in Utah, some are very anti-immigrant policies, some of the narrative of the criminalization of our communities, our immigrant communities. And I started thinking a lot about recent bills like HB 261 or anti-EDI bill, and started saying, my son with this bill will not have a Chicano son, will not have a center that he can walk into at the University of Utah and see himself. He will not have cultural programming to reinforce who he is. And so there is a concept called, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, identitarianism. And it is a movement from 2015, and the Southern Poverty Law called it a movement born in France in recent years that preaches opposition to multiculturalism, often taking shape in the form of anti-Muslim xenophobia. So this is happening in Europe. But in the US, this movement focuses on preserving Western culture as it is imagined, right? If we look at Western movies, right? Look at Western novels. I've been really into it. There's a scholar who wrote Sabrina and Corina, and she traces her family in New Mexico and talks about growing up with Western stories and music, but yet her family was never part of that stories. And so now as an author, she has rewritten the Western, right? This canon or this genre in literature. Neo-Nazi Richard Spencer and the alt-right have used this term of identitarianism as white people as victims of cultural dispossession and immigration as a proxy war against white people. And I was thinking a lot about this because in a recent interview, our Governor Cox, and I'm going to take out my notes for this because I want to make sure I get it right. He was talking about his oppositions to the EDI bill. And he said about what has really shaped his thinking about this. And he said, we want everyone to come to the table, but it should be a potluck, right? Bring the best of you and the best of your culture and your background. And let's come together and let's have an amazing feast. Sadly, instead of exclusion, the I in DEI, it's becoming exclusion. We all have to get into our tribes. We have to get into our own groups. And I think that's harming people on our campuses. And the reason I highlight that quote is that in this movement of identitarianism, That's positioning EDI or DEI work as exclusionary, that people are self-segregating, that people don't want to intermingle. And I've been thinking a lot about why HB 261 was successful. And it was this idea of preserving, right, this identity of who we are. And for me, that was very impactful to read this, because in these bills, right, on the left, and then once again, thank you, Margie Delgado, for all your archives. And you're able to see that in 1972, Chicanos present an academic proposal, and maybe some of you were part of that, right, to create a Chicano studies program. And you appoint advisor of Chicano affairs. Anybody know who that was? Pete Suazo, right? So the archives here. And Utah, Nevada adopts new Chicano textbook that was written by, and this was, and I believe this is the textbook that Ed Meyer wrote, that was to be adopted by the Utah curriculum, right? But then we have that, right? We have 1972 to now, that's how many years? 30, 52 years, over 50 years that this was proposed. And in fact, when we go to the archives, you see that 70% walk out of the Chicano seminar at the U. So they walked out until the president at the time of the University of Utah conceded and put it in writing that a Chicano studies program was going to be established. 52 years later, we have keeping up with Utah's anti-EDI. My university is repurposing 8 student centers, one of them being the Latino Cultural Center and the Dream Center. They're no longer going to exist. When our very first Chicana was hired at the University of Weber State University, she also helped to establish the ethnic studies program. We didn't really have an ethnic studies program for a long time. The U has had it. We know with this bill, the ethnic studies program will remain, but other events and activities that are characterized as identity-based will no longer exist. Here, Governor said he didn't see evidence of these DEI programs work. Here's the data Utah colleges say they're giving him. So they've given him all this data. And I wish he would have gone to the archives, because in 1972, and even Ed, when I was talking to him, there was only 3 Latinos on campus, right? And if we look at the archives, they said, we have 50 students on this campus, we want 100, right? Every year, the Chicano Scholarship Fund was created to increase the number of Chicanos on campus. And so for me, it was a little bit like, the data is there. The historical archives are there that it's worked. Chicanos, Hispanics here in Utah have self-outreached. They've created programs to do this. And so I was thinking a lot about, well, I can't go back. The bill is here, the law is here, right? And I wanted to tell a story about how do we keep this alive, right? The bill's here, they're gonna dismantle these programs. It's happening, right? And so I started using these archives and records and publications, and I selected 8 places that had a historical connection to the Chicano Latino community in Utah. And I said, these programs are going to be disbanded. There's no plaques. There's no historical building, right? How am I going to teach my 10-year-old, who's right there, about the fact that we've always been here, right? There's always been a community here, and it's always been a struggle to keep our history. So with my son in tow, I drove to places and took a photo. I don't want to claim that I did all the work, because I had a lot of help by Chris, Macias, and Jared. Some buildings still stand, but others have been demolished. And I purposely wanted my son to go with me to see where it used to be. Solorzano and Perez Huber talk about this notion of micro of racial microaffirmations. So microaggressions are assaults, right? That we experience, or put downs that we experience. And microaffirmations are everyday forms of affirmation, validation that people of color engage in. The nods. So when I've been in certain spaces at Weber State where I see another person that might look like me, anybody want to know what kind of nod we do to each other? Right? Smiles, right? Embraces use of language and other actions that express acknowledgement. Like sometimes when I'm walking down the street and I see another person, right? And I'm like, oh, we could be related. We're like primos, right? Respect and self-worthy. Because I remember when I got here 17 years ago and I saw someone that looked like me, I was like, oh, is she from? Is she here? Is she from Utah? Like, is she visiting? She's probably from California like me, right? But we begin to make that connection, and those are called racial microaffirmations. And I want that for my son and my other one. He's 3 years old. He couldn't be here because imagine the 3-year-old here, right? And so this idea of we need to affirm ourselves, right? So the first place I took him, because we live in Rose Park, we went to the Jackson Euclid Station. And it was a mural project that started in 2012, 12 years ago, and it was Comunidades en Solidaridad, a collective transformative vision by Ruby Chacon of Salt Lake City. And so I had him, you see him, he's right there standing, and I said, this is your story here. We live in Rose Park. This was created to tell the story of this community. And this is called placemaking, right? And I said, this history is not being taught to you, but you need to know it. And due to, I don't know, I don't work for the city, but there's a lot of little, if you see on the left, they were all little squares. Some of them are missing. I don't know where they're at. But that also tells us, it's very telling, right? That it was created, but there wasn't an effort to preserve it, right? That's living history of our people. And some of the blocks are missing. And so Emiliano's there, and I was telling him that your temple has a historical significance, right? When I first moved to Utah, they said, oh, you gotta go to Rose Park, North Temple. Before Rancho Market, it was something else, and then it was something else, and then it became Rancho Market again, right? You have to go to Mestizo. You have to go on the other side. And so I wanted him to start there. And then I said, you know, I need to teach you about Archie and Louis Archuleta. And we didn't get a chance to go to the bridge because if you've been in this area recently, there's a lot of activity there. So, but it's also very telling, right? And so my hope is, and this is a little political plug, if the MLB comes to Utah, that this gets highlighted, this bridge, because it's just right there, right? And I put the map here. And in 1962, I shouldn't even read about it because you want to know Archie, right? Taught elementary school for 30 years, co-founded Horizonte High School, and later taught sociology at SLIC. This bridge in 2022 was in remembrance of him. And so I said, okay, and I said this to Chris, we got the Euclid Jackson mural, the bridge, where else do you go? And he's like, I love food. So we went to the archives, and it was written that Abraham Mejia opened up in 1907, the very first Mexican restaurant in Utah. So I took my son and I said, you love food, food connects people, brings people together. And you see him on the right or your left, it is now the Capitol Grill in City Creek. That doesn't even have a marker, but that's where the very first Mexican restaurant was in 1907. And this has been confirmed by archivists here in Utah. And then I said, okay, we love food. So we have a bridge, we have a mural. We are gonna go, I want you to know about the University of Utah, but I want you to know about a specific organization, Socio. That was established 1967. You had the Chicano Student Union and later became the Redwood. We didn't get a chance to go down to the Redwood, but the original building is no longer there. So now it's a new building. But if you go to the University of Utah, the Socio where they held their meetings was at the annex. right? There's nothing there because now there's a new building, right? There is no plaque at the University of Utah to acknowledge this very significant organization. And I was able to find this because of someone who's here. And that is Martin, keep talking about her, right? Because all of this has been archived, but it's in the library. And so I told my son, so as we were driving around, I had him read it through my phone. And I said, in 1970, you had people that looked like you that were fighting for a better future for the next generations. And guess what? You're that next generation. And I want you to know this history. I want you to know what they did to fight for access. And here you had some Chicanas, some Latina women, Hispanic women, who were also helping to organize and be part of this movement. And so then I said, what else happened at the University of Utah? And in 1993, it was the establishment of Venceremos, the newspaper. And I believe it has been dormant for almost a decade. The last issue, I believe, was 2012, but it had been in a student newspaper that highlighted the stories of Chicanos and Hispanics here in Utah. In talking with Chris Macias, it sounds like there is an effort to digitalize and archive all the issues of Venceremos. He did tell me, like, I can give you the original from 1992, 1993 to see, but they exist. But this is also an example, right? I don't have, right, to show my son or my sons, or even my own teachers that prepare these very important stories that they say. So we continued our journey. We lived right by West High School. And I wanted him to know that West High School was a place, like a hub where a lot of things happened. It is also where Pete Suazo graduated from and later became the Utah State House of Representatives. And I believe he was the very first Chicano political leader we had here. Yes? Oh my goodness. You Senate, right? And so I talk about him all the time, just so you know. We didn't get a chance to go in front of the boxing gym, but every single time I would drop him off at the Boys and Girls Club right there in North Temple, I would tell him the Chicano politician who changed the way how we talked about education and economic mobility. This is named after him. The Suazo Business Center, right, was named after him. In Ogden, Suazo is there. And so I tell people all the time, so when they raised their hand, my student didn't know, said, Suazo Business Center, Suazo Boxing Gym, no frame of reference, right? So as a teaching at the university, at Weber State, I tried to bring these micro affirmations, right? And then we went to the Guadalupe Center. And this one's got a little complicated for me, and I know you all might know this history, but there was La Morena Cafe there. And now it's a courtyard hotel right in front of the Delta Center. And my son, who's here, was really sad. And I said, why? He's like, they've been demolished. Why? And so I started thinking a lot about that, right? About how am I going to teach? And I know I'm making it personal here, and I'll show you at the end what I'm proposing to do is, this is living history, but it's not there, right? The archives tells us that the Guadalupe Center was established with the leadership of Father Merrill, right? Who then later became the Guadalupe Mission, who then later became the Guadalupe School that is just down the street from where we live. And so it became a hub, and and maybe you all can help me, but they say Socio was created here in Morena Cafe, but then I've also heard about La Frontera in Poplar Grove, Silvestres, Café Silvestre. So I don't know, but that's our genealogy, right? So La Frontera, I said, we got to go to La Frontera, because when I moved to Utah, that's where I met all the Chicanos from Utah, Hispanic, from the Chicano Scholarship Fund. that was the lunch where we met. And later I learned that this was also like the hangout spot. You see a lot of folks were there. A lot of things were thought about here at La Frontera. And so I had him go. So you see him here. And then I told him, we're going to go to the Guadalupe Catholic Church. And so there is the Guadalupe Catholic Church right behind or right next to Jackson Elementary, who the school is going to be demolished soon or closed down, sorry. But I was telling him that a lot of the archive or a lot of the work about the story of Chicanos and Latinos in Utah can go back to even in Price, Utah, around the diocese there, right? The Catholic. And so a lot of this has always been the Guadalupe neighborhood of the Guadalupe Church has always been kind of like an epicenter, right? To tell the stories of Hispanic Latinos here in Utah. And so I took him to all these places. I didn't get a chance to go down to the church in Midvale. I didn't get a chance to go to the St. Patrick's Church in Poplar Grove. I also didn't get a chance to, somebody was mentioning a farm in a West Jordan area that also was a gathering spot where people would go. But the reason I started this is that there is a professor named Joel Zapata. He is now a professor in Oregon State, but he did a project called Digital Mapping and Exhibiting the Plains Chicano Movement. And this is in the Plains area. And started saying, like, oftentimes when we read about the Chicano movement or the civil rights movement, even in our textbooks, it's always centered around California and Texas, or sometimes Arizona. That we forget that that same message. And in going through the archives, like we had Teatro Campesino here in Utah. We had important people from that movement visit here in Utah. So I know there's been some dissertations, some publications about the Chicano movement here. So what this scholar did for their dissertation is they created a digital map. And I saw it and I said, what would it look like to create an interactive timeline and map with a curated online collection of materials? I'm dreaming big here. Regarding the Utah Chicano Hispanic Civil Rights Movement. And so if you go back to these pictures here, this is his dissertation project. You see the map, right? The interactive map. And it talks about the different places. And then there's a timeline here about in the Great Plains, so it's in central United States. And then when you click on the spot, it tells you a short description of it. And I loved it so much, so that's why when you see the pictures of my son, it has a Google map. In hopes that in my phone, on my Google Maps, I've said, oh, you want to know more about Chicanos or Latinos here in Utah? There's this Google map that you can go and you can go visit. With that caveat that sometimes there's different interpretations of it, right? Is it Café Silvestre? Is it La Frontera? Is it Morena Café? But it's important to tell it. I was even like in looking for this places, I started putting the Google Maps of it. And so when in my part for Tumultuous time and going back, we have this bill, right? And the bill is that these centers are no longer going to exist, right? But my argument is that we've made history without a center. We've made history without a curriculum. And it is more important now. So in my op-eds when I've written is to highlight this history. And the reason I do this is I'm not from Utah, but I've been here for 17 years. So I consider myself a part of this community, and I'm raising 2 young children here. And I want them to know that this bill, because of its roots on racist nativism, may make it feel like you just come to the table if you're the very best of the culture. But I want them to know that there is a history here, and it's a history that needs to be preserved. So that is what I have for you today. Oh, I forgot to say the last part. I know that I was gonna present to a group of experts. So special thanks, that's Emiliano in front of Rediwana. I wasn't sure to add Rediwana yet here, but I did take a picture of the original Rediwana and I had him stand in front of it. So special thanks to Jared and Chris Macias. And so if you would like, if there is a place that has a significance to the Hispanic, Latino, Chicano community, if you scan the QR code, I've added extra slides where you can help me put the name of the place and maybe a sentence or a photo. And we do a lot of little family adventures where we go visit different towns, you know, camping and hiking. And every single time that I go to a place, I make sure that I teach my son about maybe the local people around. And so this is something I've always done since he was born. I keep talking about him and he's here in front, but he'll tell you, you have a PhD in what, Emiliano? Chicano studies. He tells people he has a PhD in Chicano studies. And a lot of it is this effort to take him places that tell a story. So we went once to Park City, to Anaya's Market, right off Main Street, to say all this elegance here, right behind it. You get the best tacos, and I've heard the market is no longer there, where this is where the workers would go, right? So it's making this effort to have him know that you might read from the outside a history of pioneers, a history of settlers, a history of local people, but other local people were here too. And so if you would like to add to this project, it is just a project that I picked up for because I'm a teacher, right? And in its collection of it. So thank you.
I didn't become a Chicana until 1971. The Ford Foundation sponsored it. So like those pictures you have in 1968, and you don't have any names. Would you like names?
Oh, I would love names.
Oh, yeah, don't you know it? I'd have to look at it.
Yeah.
Gloria probably knows, but some of those groups, like, it looks like a dance group on the floor.
Yeah.
They're probably from the Lucille Award. Or
Yes, and I didn't add it to the slides. We actually went to the Lucette Award. And my son, that's where he was really sad because it was a preschool now.
Yeah.
And so we actually have a picture in front of the Lucette Award. And I just realized that I didn't put that one on my Google Slides. We went to the Lucette Awards, and that's when he made the comment like, Mom, they're either demolished or they're turned into something different.
so, I mean, like, there's a lot of people that came on. I got photos when, what's his name? This guy.
Valdez?
Yeah, we brought him here.
Yeah,
Luis.
Luis Valdez.
I got photos of Luis Valdez and the Keon books that came through.
Yeah.
But, do it again. No, Edward Gable. We got photos of him. They were at the time that started with, for a conference. No, they came for Sundance and Poncho was too shy to do it, so he put it on me and Maria, and I grabbed Maria.
Yeah.
Because back then I didn't talk a lot. So I grabbed Maria, so Maria and I escorted them around.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh,
Yeah, and I think that that's what, when I was going through it, and I always think like a teacher, right? I always think like, this is a story and stories, and I know from talking to Chris, there is an effort to identify a historical building, but there's so many things to think through, right? Because it has to be a building that still is there, right? But I know there's always been efforts to create lesson plans and create, to teach this. right? Since my son was little, I've created books for him, just using, and telling him different stories. And I love that because I think that that's in my brain, right? Is yes, a textbook is good, but we also know that it also happens when they're K-6, right? K-8, and making it fun and interactive for them to just click on it and say, actually, the Afro-Campesino is here. You have these very powerful people. And I believe her name is Deborah Silva, who became the OEO for Weber State. She was, I'm missing her name right now. And I remember going to the president of Weber State and saying, she was the first Chicana here. I don't have a portrait of her or some information about her here at Weber State. I know for a very long time, when I first met our chief, he said, I'm the first Chicano educator here in Utah. And I was like, nobody has said I wasn't. But, even that need to say, like, who was the very first? And who was the very first judge? Who was the very first elected official, right? But that's a history that interests me a lot.
Those are the 1970s. A lot of us were the first in our field.
Yeah.
I'm a probation officer hired, and it was because of Pete, because I wasn't going to go in that area, and he goes, look, we're going to apply for this job. And I just did whatever Pete told us. Like Archie always said, he was from Grand Beach, Colorado, where I was born. A year before he died, I finally made a meeting and sat down with him and Lois. He rented from my grandmother in the junction in the Tulsa, and he always told me how his family paid my grandmother with a little sheet. But then later on, after he passed away, Lois called me and showed me his report card, and the address is right there across from the room.
Wow.
I never knew that.
Yeah, I actually just told Ed, I'm like, the degree of separation of people here is very small. And I know I'm out of time, but my hope is, and I wanted to say, how do we keep this story alive? For me as an educator and as a teacher educator working with future educators is this is where it's needed more. And this bill passed, and there's a lot of changes that are going to happen, but it doesn't mean that we find other spaces, which is the placemaking, right? There's a lot of efforts, community efforts have always happened to have the mural, right? And the mural is not because we love pretty art. It is because it tells the story of our people. And so for me, in keeping the story alive, I wanted to let you know that I value your stories. And every day I remind my son that there were people here that have made it possible for me to be a professor, because that was a dream back then in 1972, hire more Chicano professors, more staff, and also for him to know who he is, right? And not wait for the district to teach him, but find other ways to teach him. So I drove him around the city. So thank you so much. Oh, don't leave.
I
Okay.
got you trapped. You're not gonna get out. Real quickly, I have a soccer teams I work with. I teach them about slow motion and hyper speed. So I'm gonna go in hyper speed mode now, right now. We got very little time. I want all the university people I know to stand up, and Ed, and yeah, University of Utah people in particular, and even Priscilla and I forget your name, Archie. Okay, these people are the people that you're talking about right now.
Yeah.
These people back in 1969, 70, all the way through now, whatever. They've had kids and grandkids now, but these were the people here. Alex Pacheco was the first president of the Chicano student group at the University of Utah.
I didn't vote for him.
Huh?
I did.
I didn't vote for him. He's a nice guy. You know, Alicia Swalzes, Pete Swalzes' wife. And I think she doesn't look at, she's one of the oldest members of the whole group. She's been around forever. And Ed, and his wife are both doctors. Oh, he's the oldest, that's right. He's born in the 1800s. He's really old. But all these people are key people in our community. All the things you talk about, these people really grew up with. They really
Yeah.
did. So they're wonderful
And then
people.
Emiliano, I want you to take a look. Of all the places that we went to, these are the people that helped establish those places.
There's so many things you didn't mention, but they know about this, but they're so good, you know, but you've been a wonderful speaker.
Thank you
And
so
boy,
much.
We want to have you back every month. Lot more.
And I just want to once again, thank you. And I would love to take a picture for my own selfish reasons because like I said, this presenting to you, it was more about finding a way to continue to teach my son, right? To continue to make sure that we don't wait for that textbook to be adopted by the USVE, but we know we teach our histories. So, or to take a class with Ed. You know?
We have people from Colorado and Idaho stuff, they're gonna have to run through the same problem, but they're.
Yeah.
What would be a good place to take a big group picture? Out in the hallway or down here? Huh?
Okay, so we could go outside.
Okay, well, I got a couple more things real quick and then we'll take that picture before you leave. But do not leave. Is that your phone?
Yes.
Yeah, mine's it.
Okay, so I'm gonna
Okay,
go
I'm
put that.
gonna show you a quick picture. This is my wife's family, but it's an example. This is them when they were younger and this is them now. Okay, they're getting older and they're not gonna be around forever. Anyway, I read a book recently by Julie Alvarez. It's called Cemeteries of Lost Stories, something like that. But it talks about this lady that is a great author that she had to bury her stories in the cemetery, and before she did it, she burned them up. I think it was symbolic of the stories that we have here that are gone by the wayside. She made a quote in the book that said, when a young person dies, a story is lost. But when a grandparent dies or an old person, a library is lost. A lot of stories here that they have of their children, their grandchildren, whatever. We need to make sure that we interview them and talk to them. 50 years ago, we did some interviews with some other people. I was involved with that project, Margie Archuleta, and then a few, and Ed Gonzalez. They're at the library at the University of Utah, but the people we interviewed have been dead for 40 years now. But we interviewed them and we got their stories. And back then they spoke in Spanish a lot more than they do now.